US President Joe Biden has warned that America's democracy is under threat from the rising power of an ultra-wealthy elite and a, quote, tech industrial complex. He gave the warning in his farewell speech from the White House days ahead of Donald Trump's return to office. Biden also warned that artificial intelligence could pose new threats to people's rights and their privacy unless safeguards were put in place.
Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead. We see the consequences all across America. I'm equally concerned about the potential rise of a tech industrial complex that could pose real dangers for our country as well. Americans are being buried under an avalanche of misinformation and disinformation, enabling the abuse of power.
Now, while Biden didn't mention any of the super wealthy by name, it is assumed that he was referring to the billionaire tech elites wielding significant influence through their ownership of media outlets. It's not the first time in American history that considerable power has been concentrated in the hands of a few. In the late 1800s, a handful of industrialists, later called robber barons, amassed huge fortunes by exploiting workers and natural resources, and by controlling prices. And for more on this, I am joined now by David Lingelbach, a professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Baltimore. Thanks so much for joining us. He is a co-author, I should mention, of a book called The Oligarchs' Grip: Fusing Wealth and Power. Welcome to DW. Thank you so much for your time. David, you've looked at oligarchs in power in various countries around the world. How seriously should people in the United States be taking President Biden's warning here?
I think his warning is spot on. I think it's serious. And I think that people in the United States should be taking it very, very seriously indeed. In fact, I think that we would go actually one step further than what President Biden said last evening, which is that the United States was essentially founded as a kind of oligarch's republic. So it's true, we have a big problem today, but we've been dealing with this issue for 250 years. And as the current circumstances indicate, we still have not gotten a good handle on it.
Should we assume, though, that all oligarchs, rich business leaders with political influence, are they all always bad?
I would say that they're not always all bad. In fact, in the book that Valentina Rodriguez-Guerra and I wrote, we identified a number of oligarchs who did some remarkably good things. I'll just point out two. Al Gore, who many people don't think of as an oligarch, is obviously someone who's done a tremendous amount of good in bringing global attention to the issue of climate change. And a little bit further back in time, Herbert Hoover, who, let's be honest, has a very mixed sort of view amongst historians, did tremendous good at the end of World War I in helping to feed so many people across Europe and what was then the Soviet Union. So yes, oligarchs can, in fact, do good. I think these days we're a little bit more focused on some of the less good things that they're doing.
So these days we're looking at tech oligarchs. Tell us what it is about the American tech oligarchs that could make them a danger to democracy.
Yeah, Anya, I think this is the key issue that my co-author Valentina Rodriguez-Guerra and I are focusing on in our new book. Tech oligarchs, particularly those that are focusing on search and now AI, have already shaped the way in which we all think and act. And that is really, in many ways, the highest form of power. It is essentially unregulated power. It is not a power that's easily defensible against. And so this is the thing, I think this is the issue of our times. How do we contain oligarchs who are doing things that are fundamental to the human condition? And how do we, as citizens in the world, in the US and elsewhere, how do we have a voice in helping to contain those activities.
What could Americans learn from the experience of other countries?
Well, firstly, it's difficult to contain oligarchs. In fact, you really almost have to go back to ancient Greece, which had a number of states that were oligarchies, to find examples of how to contain oligarchs. And indeed, just to use the ancient Greek example, the oligarchs there essentially contained themselves. They were self-regulating. They realized that if their power and wealth became too unchecked, that the society would basically revolt against them. And so I think, in those societies at that time, they found a way forward. Today, let's be honest, I think we're all struggling to figure out what to do. I think piecemeal activities like sanctioning oligarchs or even convicting them of crimes are not really addressing the fundamental issue here, which is that oligarchs are a kind of a structural problem, and one that we're just at the early stages of getting a handle on.
And if we don't get a handle on them, I mean, is there any particular point of no return that you can identify, after which voters are essentially shut out and the country is fully in the hands of these oligarchs we're talking about?
Well, I mean, I hate to use the analogy because I think it does tend to get overused, but the example of post-communist Russia does come to mind. That's where my initial experience with this phenomenon began. You can see what happens. You essentially have two different oligarch systems that evolved in Russia after the fall of communism, and neither one of them were great. The current system, which is presided over by Mr. Putin, is not great for the bulk of the Russian people. So we could see something like that. The only thing that is constraining, of course, in the U.S. is a constitutional order that does provide some checks and balances, and a political culture that does still feel, at least to me, as having some elements of being democratic. Admittedly, frayed. The democracy of the United States is frayed, and I worry a lot as a citizen that many Americans are simply overwhelmed by what is happening to them and beginning to tune out. So I think we could probably avoid what happened to Russia. But again, in the United States, at least, oligarchs have been a thing for a long time. They're a feature of the system.
David Lingelbach, Professor of Entrepreneurship at the University of Baltimore. Thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating stuff.
Thank you.